So there's a YouTube comment that I want to read to you here. It says, I feel immensely guilty whenever I feel the need to tell a loved one or almost anyone no. I get sent into a panicky state, and if I don't do the thing I'm asked, or if I don't do the things that someone else doesn't want to do, then it'll be my fault for them being upset. I get this feeling that it will turn into a horridly toxic argument that leads to me feeling guilty and shamed for setting boundaries. This is common for people who would identify as being people pleasers or codependents. There is this sense that if I'm not people pleasing at all times, then the other person will become angry. Where does this come from? Well, obviously, it's a pattern from childhood. Most likely, you were raised in an environment where if you weren't going out of your way to fawn and to please a parent or parents or authority figure, then negative consequences would be the result. There is a highly insecure, highly narcissistic, egotistical parenting style that sees any kind of assertion of boundaries in the child as a narcissistic injury and the cause for punishment and humiliation, maybe physical, maybe emotional. As adults, we need to recognize that tendency, and we need to see it in ourselves and say, okay, this is not how a person should live. This is not how a person needs to live. I don't need to go through this. It's making my life much, much harder than it needs to be. And it makes you extremely vulnerable to exploitative, entitled personality types who would be quite comfortable taking advantage of you if you let them. So these are people who, if you said, okay, my pH neutral state is pleasing, they'll go, that's great, and they'll just soak it up. They won't have the honor and the decency and the impulse control to say to you, listen, stop. You don't need to do that. You don't need to do that for me. You don't need to do that for anybody. You shouldn't live this way. So where's all this coming from? We know it comes from childhood, but where is it in the moment of now, of today? Well, it's inside of you. It's inside of everybody who has codependency issues. What's the real problem? The problem is emotional. It's an emotions issue. People always get a little squirrely and nervous as soon as I start talking about emotions. Don't get freaked out. Emotions are nothing more than messengers to you in the moment with a positive intent. They're trying to warn you against things that are dangerous and move you towards things that are good for you. Your emotions are messengers. You should listen to them. You should act in an intelligent way in response to your emotions without being a slave to them. You can detach from your emotions, but you should still observe them and acknowledge them. When you have an emotion, you experience an emotion, you don't have to identify it, you don't have to become the emotion. I will claim that there's no such thing as a codependent, hyper-fawning, hyper-agreeable people pleaser who isn't also intensely emotionally dysregulated. For the codependent, for the people pleaser, navigating relationships with other people is like doing ballet through a minefield. The mines are negative emotions. What we're really trying not to do is to touch on our own negative emotions and other people's negative emotions. It seems a little strange. Why would we care about our emotions as much as we care about other people's emotions? Well, because, here's another somewhat controversial claim, codependency and people-pleasing lies on a spectrum of psychosis. Don't worry, you're not psychotically delusional, but you're psychotic to the extent that you struggle to tell the difference between your emotions and other people's emotions. You struggle to tell the difference between your feelings, your thoughts, your desires, and other people's thoughts, feelings, and desires. This, because of this lack of boundaries, usually from highly narcissistic and tyrannical parents who wouldn't let you form your own boundaries, who demanded that you take on their desires, their persona, as though it were your own, there's just a lack of boundaries now. There's a total lack of boundaries, and in that lack of boundaries, psychosis spreads like a sickness. So there's going to be a difficulty for you to distinguish between what you're feeling and what the other person is feeling. And you'll probably experience other people's feelings as though they are your own. This is a problem. In order for you to live a normal, healthy, long, enjoyable, happy life, you must overcome that issue. You can't live like that. Nobody can. Added to that is there is something called emotophobia. Emotophobia, not emetophobia, that's the fear of people throwing up. Emotophobia is the fear of negative emotions, both in yourself and in others. So you're doing ballet through a minefield, trying not to trigger your own negative emotions that you can't deal with because most likely you're highly emotionally dysregulated, but you don't know it. You're highly emotionally illiterate, but you don't know it. And you're terrified of other people's negative emotions because when you were a child, if your mother or your father experienced any tiny amount of disappointment in you whatsoever, perhaps they exploded into a rage, perhaps they would hit you, perhaps they would sulk for days on end, perhaps they would become neglectful. I don't know exactly what happened, but huge amounts of pain was the result. That's what happens when you put your foot on a landmine. It's a very small movement. You put your foot in the wrong place and huge amounts of catastrophic pain is the result. That's why I call them, it's a minefield. These are mines for you, for me, when I'm being codependent as well. Of course, it's not real. It's not true. There are no terrible negative consequences as an adult unless you are living with a psychopath who's criminally inclined, in which case this is an issue for the police. It's not an issue for psychology YouTube videos. Because if there is an actual negative consequence to you disappointing somebody, like, I don't know, they physically attack you or they physically wound you, that's a legal issue. You go straight to the police with that. If it's not psychopathy, but it's narcissism, the only leverage they have against you is how you feel inside of your own body, your own emotions. This is why it makes us incredibly vulnerable if we're emotionally illiterate. If we're not in contact with our own emotions, if we can't define how we feel to a nuance, we're at the mercy of our feelings. So if I have the capacity to make you feel terrible with a look, with an expression, with a sentence, I have too much power over you. No adult should have that kind of power over another adult. That makes no sense. Adults have that kind of power over children, but they absolutely should not exploit it. That is abuse. That is abuse. That is a surefire way to turn your children into boundary-broken, fawning, servile, slave-mentalityed codependents. Don't do it. There is a friend of mine, she's a good human being, and she works with children, and we were discussing how she disciplines children. She's from Hungary, but she works in Germany because she speaks German, and she goes on camps that children have been sent on when they have behavioural difficulties. She has a really good rapport with the children. One night we were talking about, because I worked in schools for 5 years, how she does discipline with the kids. And she said that when she's dealing with 12, 13 and 14-year-olds, if they do something wrong, she's found a good way of manipulating them into not doing it again is to guilt trip them. Is to make them feel like she's really disappointed in something that they did. And I said to her, that's clever and a low-calorie way of leveraging emotion to get what you want, but it's actually abusive. You shouldn't guilt-trip children into following the rules. You shouldn't make children feel humiliated by making them think they've caused you to experience negative emotion so that they experience negative emotion so that they then do what they want, so that they then do what you ultimately want them to do. It's a perversion of their will to force children to feel negative emotions about you feeling negative emotions so that they have to become hypervigilant to how you feel. Is that really how we want to raise young adults on those principles? I have to do better so that you don't feel bad. That's weak. That's really weak. There should be a greater driver for them doing what it is that they want, that you want them to do. Otherwise, you're asking them to do something that is just pointless and stupid. If we have to fall back to these tactics of emotional manipulation, we're going to break children's boundaries and we're going to make them codependent. We're forcing hypervigilance onto them. Hypervigilance of other people's emotions, being nervous and frightened of feeling bad for the possibility that other people might feel bad as a cause of our actions, is a recipe for codependency. We're not talking about eradicating conscience, eradicating morality. Of course, we don't want to train kids to go through life and not care about how other people feel, but that cannot be a primal motivator for why people do what they do. It's incredibly weak, and it's a real perversion of children's will for when they grow up into adults. It will make them hyper-vigilant of other people's emotional states, and it will make them hyper-agreeable, where instead they'd be better off having the capacity to simply say no. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and for your attention. I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Okay folks, the new course, Unplug from the Matrix of Narcissistic Abuse, is out now. And if you're interested in finding out more about that, please click the link below.